In a lot of my videos talking about new GPUs, I see comments saying just buy a used 3080. In this video, that's what we're investigating, and we're going to pair it up against the RTX 5070 for a couple of reasons. One is that gets you a lot of the modern features and performance and isn't wildly above its MSRP, so it's a card I think a lot of people may be interested in. But what if you just bought a card on the used market like the 3080? Now, one thing we need to look at is feature set differences and all of that, but we also do need to look at the price differences. If I tried to buy a new 5070 right now, I would be paying around $620. Its MSRP is meant to be $550, but it's just not available at that price in the United States, actually in stock. Might occasionally flash in stock at that price, but it does not just sit there. If you want to just go out and buy one, you're paying a little over $600. How about used 3080s though? Now I could scroll through eBay all day and look at a bunch of sold listings at a wide variety of price points, some of them pretty low. But I was looking for a better tool to track this. Honestly, I don't know how good this site is, but this site claims to pull in an average price and track prices over time for different products on eBay. And the results it's spitting out seem to be roughly in line with what I'm seeing on eBay, so let's go with this to give us a ballpark figure. Remember, the specific value you get on your specific purchase on eBay can be different than the average anyway. It's saying that the 90-day average price for a 3080, 12 gigabyte. By the way, do note I'm using the 12 gigabyte version of the 3080. One reason is then we're matching the 12 gigabytes on the 5070 so that VRAM capacity doesn't get in the way of our performance comparisons. But keep in mind there are 10 gigabyte versions, and that was the more common and original version. Although I recommended on my channel that people go out and get the 12 gigabyte version if the price was similar, which it generally was. Anyway, also that's just the version of the 3080 I have, because that's the one I bought for that reason. Anyway, now that being said, for the 3080 12 gigabyte here, it's saying an average of about 470, although it does range over time. If you look at a distribution of individual sales over this time period, you can see that they're ranging kind of in the $200 up to $700 range. Generally, I'm wondering if on these lowest ones, it might be pulling in ones that were not in great condition despite having set the filters to not be like just for parts or something like that. Price distribution, you can kind of view this way as well. But if we go with about 470 for the average price versus 620 for the price of a new 5070, we can say, okay, new 5070 versus used 3080 is about a 32% price premium. Now you're getting a new product instead of a used product, and there's some feature set differences, warranty differences, all of that. But what about the performance? So let's start jumping into performance and feature set. Now we should discuss feature set because if you go with the 30 series GPU, you are not getting access to Nvidia's frame generation. Now you are getting access to frame generation from like a third-party app like lossless scaling, or even games that integrate AMD's frame generation. You can access that on 30 series GPUs, but Nvidia's frame generation is not available. Now, the 5070 has not just access to the original ×2 frame gen mode, but also the ×3 and ×4 modes. So do keep that in mind. Now, how big of a selling point is this? My honest take on frame generation is it is a nice to have feature if you have a high refresh rate monitor, because it can increase the motion smoothness on a high refresh rate display. I don't consider it performance because the game is not responding to user input more quickly. Also, there can be image quality artifacts in it. It's not perfect. In general, when looking at frame gen, keep in mind that if we look at frame gen off versus like ×4 frame gen on, which is what we're seeing here and here on the 5070, notice that latency increases when we turn on frame generation. Generally, if you run a game at a higher frame rate, latency decreases. That's not happening here because of the way frame gen works. It's buffering a frame before it shows it on your display. In other words, it's slightly delaying showing you a frame the game actually rendered to then take 2 frames the game has rendered and use their frame generation algorithm to guess what happened in between. Now, it then generates those frames and inserts them, and then all of those are then displayed on your display in sequence. So you see more frames on your display, you get increased motion fluidity, but you do not get increased responsiveness, you get slightly decreased responsiveness. Anyway, so keep that in mind. I don't think frame generation is a great way to go from a fairly low frame rate to a high frame rate and have it feel good. I think it is a good way to go from an already pretty good and pretty responsive situation and then increase the fluidity on a high refresh rate display in single player games. Anyway, that is something to keep in mind. Also, the 50 series GPUs run the newer ray reconstruction better than the older GPUs, so that is something to keep in mind here. I'm going to be small, get out of the way here, and let's start looking at some results. Most of my results here aren't going to include frame generation, but I did think it was important to point out that feature set difference here. So when just running DLSS without frame generation, so that's this left-hand result and the middle result, 3080 versus 5070, here we're seeing a 30% performance advantage for the 5070, but this is using path tracing with the DLSS4 transformer model at quality and with ray reconstruction turned on. But anyway, with all of that turned on, all of the big feature sets a 30% performance advantage, and then if you do kick on frame generation, you do get 4 times the number of frames displayed on your screen. But do keep in mind that the latency is actually slightly worse with these generated frames. I would say fairly comparable though, when compared with the 3080 not running any frame generation at all. So it doesn't feel more responsive than the 3080 here, but it does have a higher refresh rate, motion fluidity on your screen. Anyway, so that's all of that. Now, I do think it's important to note that if we just look at path tracing performance, but turn off ray reconstruction and the DLSS4 upscaling model, notice that the 5070 is now only winning by 8%, meaning I don't think it's 30% faster at path tracing, where a big part of that performance lead came from was actually being faster at the newer ray reconstruction algorithm and the newer DLSS4 transformer model as well, due to improvements to their AI performance actually rather than the ray tracing performance. So interesting stuff. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on. If we did look at 4K results here, neither GPU is particularly good at 4K path tracing. Using DLSS performance and ray reconstruction turned on, but no frame generation, I'm once again seeing the 5070 pull 30% ahead here by 31%, but it's only getting 38 FPS, and I don't think that's a good frame rate from which to use frame generation. Some people might find it passable, but either way, I'm just going to say neither of these GPUs is going to be very good at 4K path tracing, even if you're using all of the DLSS features. That being said, if you're just buying games to play esports titles, you're not using path tracing, you're not using all frame generation, then honestly, this is where I think cards like the 3080 still absolutely shine. You can see Call of Duty Black Ops 6 if you're playing at 1080p basic settings, so you're like competitive settings. You turn graphic settings down, you might have a high refresh rate 1080p display. 3080 is still getting 206 FPS here. 5070 is getting 244, so it's 18% faster. But I don't think that's like a mind-blowing difference here, and you're saving a good amount of money. At 1440p, the 5070 is 14% faster at 176 versus 154. And again here, I don't think frame generation makes sense in competitive gameplay because it is increasing your latency and, in other words, decreasing your responsiveness, only slightly, but it is. And the main reason you're chasing high refresh rates in competitive titles is for the added responsiveness, not necessarily the added motion fluidity, and we're already hitting such high refresh rates that frame generation going past your monitor's max refresh rate doesn't help because, again, it's not increasing the responsiveness. Its only benefit is motion fluidity, and you lose that once you go past your monitor's max refresh rate. At 4K basic settings, we're seeing 102 FPS versus 94. 5070 is taking a 9% lead, and both of them could easily use some upscaling here. Remember, DLSS upscaling does make sense for competitive games. It does increase the performance and responsiveness. It's just frame generation where I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Anyway, but what if you're playing big Unreal Engine 5 games? Well, Silent Hill 2, 4K epic settings, neither GPU is doing great. It's 37 FPS versus 32, so a 16% lead for the 5070, but neither of them is doing awesome here. However, DLSS performance mode can save the day, honestly, on both GPUs. You're now getting 76 FPS on the 5070 versus 64 on the 3080. It's a 19% lead for the 5070. Both cards are doing fine here. Now, again, this game does support frame generation, all that. Honestly, I kept frame generation turned off in this game when I played it myself because I didn't really like the visual corruption that I was seeing, especially in menus, but also in gameplay. 4K Epic RT DLSS performance. So here basically turning on hardware-based Lumen. This game does support hardware-based Lumen. Here we're seeing that reduces performance to 63 and 55 respectively. The 5070 is taking a 15% lead, but both of these are still very playable in this slow pace of a game. At 1440p, Epic settings with hardware Lumen turned on. We're only seeing 50 FPS versus 47 FPS. Not amazing, still playable in this slow of a game if you have a variable refresh rate display. 5070 is only 6% ahead here. However, I do think it would make sense to at least turn on DLSS quality. Now frame rates are 75 and 66, with the 5070 taking a 14% advantage. If we turn off hardware-based Lumen and turn off upscaling at 1440p Epic settings, we're seeing 61 versus 54, 13% lead for the 5070. If we kick on DLSS quality, it's now 93 and 75, and I'm seeing a 24% lead for the 5070, but both GPUs are very playable here. If we go down to 1080p resolution, we're seeing Epic settings with hardware-based Lumen turned on. We're getting 73 versus 64. Good results on both GPUs. You don't need upscaling, and it's 14% lead for the 5070. If we turn the hardware-based Lumen off and just use 1080p Epic settings, we're seeing 89 versus 74, so 20% lead on the 5070. So really, I'd say both of these GPUs can handle the biggest Unreal Engine 5 games, even with hardware-based Lumen, as long as you're willing to use some upscaling at 1440p and a lot of upscaling at 4K. Another Unreal Engine 5 test we could look at is Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga at 4K high settings. Both GPUs are tied at 33 FPS, which isn't great. If we go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, we're now seeing 56 FPS versus 54. So 4% lead for the 5070, and both GPUs are now perfectly playable in this slow-paced of a title. If you're on a variable refresh rate display, you could obviously use even more aggressive upscaling if you want higher frame rates. At 1440p native high settings, we're seeing 57 FPS versus 55, 4% lead for the 5070. And you could you could use upscaling there and stuff, but again, in this game, I think it's fine. If we drop down to 1080p resolution at high settings, it's 80 versus 73, 10% lead for the 5070. Another big game, but not on Unreal Engine, Final Fantasy XVI 4K Ultra settings is incredibly demanding. These GPUs are only hitting 35 and 33 FPS respectively, 6% lead for the 5070. However, if you go to DLSS performance mode, you can get over 60 FPS on both GPUs at 74 and 64, so now a 16% lead for the 5070. If we're at 1440p Ultra settings, both GPUs are pretty usable without upscaling at 61 and 55, 11% lead for the 5070, but again, you could use upscaling here as well. If we look at that, using DLSS quality, we're now at 86 and 74, 16% advantage for the 5070, very usable experience here on both cards. 1080p Ultra settings, no upscaling or turning down settings is needed. We're at 85 versus 73, 16% advantage on the 5070. If we go to Ghost of Tsushima, we now see the 3080 take a lead by 4% at 4K very high. It's basically a tie at 51 and 49, but thought that was interesting. Ghost of Tsushima has not seemed to be a very good game for 50 series cards. They've had some issues and rather poor performance. 4K at very high DLSS quality, the 5070 now pulls ahead by 5%. Again, I'd still basically class anything within 5% either way as basically a tie. It's 81 versus 77, so both GPUs are putting up a good experience here. At 1440p native very high settings, you don't need any upscaling. It's 87 versus 84, 4% lead for the 5070, so again, basically tied. Good experience in a single player game here. 1080p very high settings, we're seeing 120 versus 111, 8% lead for the 5070, and again, good experience here, no upscaling or turning down settings needed. Horizon Forbidden West at 4K very high settings, we're seeing 52 FPS versus 50, so 4% lead for the 5070, not a big win here. Again, I basically class it as a tie. And using DLSS quality gets both GPUs up over 60 FPS at 75 and 68, 10% advantage for the 5070 here. At 1440p, I don't think we need any upscaling. We're at 89 versus 78 FPS, good experience on both, 14% advantage for the 5070. And at 1080p very high settings, we're seeing 121 FPS versus 104, 16% advantage for the 5070. Good experience on both, can max everything out just fine. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle using 4K Supreme using DLSS quality, both GPUs are broken in different ways. The 3080 is just running at 6 FPS and then sometimes crashes. And the 5070 sometimes crashes, but when it didn't crash, it just looked crazy weird. Anyway, you could turn down the texture cache and get better results, but that's what I saw at those settings. At 1440p Supreme, now things are okay on the 12GB VRAM buffer. At 97 versus 90, we're seeing an 8% advantage for the 5070, but both GPUs are doing well here. 1080p Supreme, we're seeing a 12% advantage for the 5070 at 124 versus 111, so both GPUs doing fine. So really, this game's not super hard to run, as long as, again, this is not using path tracing. This is the highest non-path tracing setting. And as long as your VRAM is under control, like I said, at the 4K results, you could just turn down the texture cache and get things under control if you needed to. In God of War Ragnarok at 4K Ultra settings, we're at 56 and 50 respectively, 12% advantage for the 5070. Good experience here, but you might as well use DLSS quality to get a lot higher refresh rate. Now we're hitting 80 and 72, 11% advantage for the 5070. At 1440p Ultra, I don't think you really need DLSS unless you want to. We're at 88 versus 71, 24% advantage for the 5070. If we go down to 1080p, it's 105 versus 98, 7% advantage for the 5070. And I think that's all the tests that I ran, at least at matching settings on both GPUs. So let's pop out for some final analysis. A summary of these results. This is not a frame rate graph. This is a average percentage difference graph. And it goes game by game through all of the tests that I ran. And that was quite a few. You can see that in the vast majority of situations, the 5070 is faster. I have assigned those results to be the positive direction here. Again, this is not frame rate, this is percentage advantage. I've assigned the 3080 to be in the negative direction, but it's still calculated as performance advantage. So a 4% lead for the 3080 is represented here as -4%, as a -4 on the chart. You can see that that's the only win for the 3080. There was one other tie, but in general, the 5070 is faster. The geomean of these results is showing that it is a 12% average for the 5070. Doesn't mean it's 12% faster in every game. Some it's more, some it's less, but that is the average of all of these results. So they're not mind-blowingly different in performance, but the 5070 is noticeably faster, but on the edge of what is noticeable. I class 5% as you can't really tell the difference without a frame rate counter, and 10% is like, if you're super sensitive to frame rate differences, you can probably tell. But it's not a mind-blowing difference. Again, a 10% advantage is like the difference between 50 FPS and 55 FPS, or 60 FPS and 66 FPS, or 100 FPS, 110 FPS. It's not a mind-blowing difference here, and 12% isn't much more than that. So I see where people are coming from when they say, just grab the used 3080. Because if you look at it from a value perspective, the 5070 is 12% faster, but looks like on average, compared to used cards, costs about 32% more. However, I would say that there's more to the story than that, because do keep in mind that the new graphics card is going to have more years of driver support. It's probably coming with a better warranty if you're even getting a warranty on your used card. Dealing with new sellers versus the potential weirdness that can happen with buying things used, I do think that there is something to be said, and that should be factored into your overall calculation. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are those feature set differences like the frame generation support, as well as running, even when you're not using frame generation, using things like ray reconstruction is also faster, like we saw showing up here. Again, the actual path tracing result wasn't that big of a difference. It was using things like ray reconstruction and all of that. So in general, again, on the just raw frames per dollar calculation, it does look like a 3080, especially if you can get the 12GB version, not the 10GB version, could offer you better value buying used rather than buying the new 5070. But like I said, there is all of those differences between a new GPU and a used GPU, as well as some of those feature set differences. I do think that buying a used 3080 could make sense, especially if you got a particularly good deal on it. Because, again, some of them are going as low as like $400. There were even some that were showing as sold at like $350. So the particular deal you get on that 3080 can make or break how good of a deal this is. Also, depending on how low of a price you can get for your new 5070. Anyway, either way, you now know how these stack up, so you can decide whether it's worth it to you, especially for the thoughts on the used GPU, differences in warranty, the experience, years of driver support, all of that. Anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day. Don't forget you can stay tuned to the channel for all sorts of head-to-head comparisons like this. I'll have some others coming up with the used 3080 idea as well, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.